Shalom, one and all. My name is Dr. Maoz Rosenthal, and I'm going to present to you part of the Herzliya indices, which are led by Professor Rafi Melnik, that deals on the political governance side. And we said just beforehand that governance is something sort of from the past, and we're still stuck in the past. We're trying to understand Israel's democracy to come and decide and implement public policy, and yet to retain the democratic framework. In order to do that, what we did is we chose a kind of database out of an entire big sort of database that were worked on at the center in Berlin that was based on a number of countries. And there were a number of databases that were used, in fact. Actually, they said from 1990 to 2014. And we'll see the next parcel of a sort of cluster of data, and they wanted to see what is democracy. They wanted to look at burgeoning democracies, established ones that are considered those, and they derived from that the various indicators that they were going to use, and they used those and determined them as their benchmarks from which they could then measure the other countries that were part of their sort of cluster. I think that the advantage that we found in this database was that there was less use of experts' evaluations, that sometimes you don't know where they emanate from, a plethora of various sources, and minimizing the errors of measurement. They wanted to assess various institutions and really focus on policy environment and policy output. And then they came up with a whole list of indicators that enabled a comparison of quite a lot of the data over time for a number of components. So each of those enabled us to do those comparisons between 0 to 100. So in general terms, the quality of democracy was measured by freedom, control, and equality. Each of those had various lower sort of sub-components, and I would like to say that there's a myriad of additional components in each of those aspects of government activities. It's a very extensive, deep research study that was carried out, and we're aware of so many other research studies, but because of the sensitivity and complexity of this topic, we decided not to use the others, but rather this database. I think from the point of view of the components that we used in our Herzliya indices that were presented by Professor Rafi Melnik yesterday, individual liberties, rule of law, public sphere, various mutual constraints, the enable capability of the government to function, transparency, representation, as was presented by Professor Rafi Melnik. So we're talking also about regulatory equality and alliances as well. Bottom line being, when Professor Melnik then showed yesterday Israel for a long period of time, in contrast to many other of those indicators, they seem to be lagging far behind many of the other comparative countries based on these indices. So in fact, it confused us. We wanted to know what really was happening. So if we're going to use the barometer indices, and we put Israel in a comparative perspective with other countries, well, first of all, you have to see what the existing trends are, and to what extent are they different from other cases. So, for example, after all, this gives you a pretty good picture about what actually exists here, vis-a-vis the lights and the shadows that we mentioned yesterday. In other words, the positive ones and the less positive ones, or problematic ones. For example, if we're talking about individual rights, civil rights, Israel is the gray line here, as one can expect from a country that has to grapple with such immense security issues and also consensus issues, as was said in the first session this morning. Israel is around at the the bottom position. And Turkey has just overtaken us, and we're trying to examine Turkey as a kind of regional benchmark, far lagging behind Denmark, which is the orange line at the top, and Germany, which is just slightly underneath, and we're trying to use those as a comparative benchmark countries. Now, from the point of view of rule of law, as I mentioned yesterday as well, there is a decrease in the rule of law because of a number of barometers that are actually working in that, because of this the decrease actually of the belief in the courts of law and in the police force, and you can see that here. And there's also a decrease in the belief in the impartiality and the bias of the actual courts of law and the actual judicial arm, and this does definitely impact this issue. Now, if we're talking about the lights and the shadows, you can see the differences between us and Germany is that nowadays the constitutional democracy that exists in Denmark, and as we're still in some kind of, let's say, a good surroundings, let's say, that we're still considered a country that we would like to compare ourselves to their democracy, but it's very difficult with the trends, what the next cluster of data is actually going to tell us. If we are going to talk about equality, Israel finds itself in its various internal parameters from that point of view, in these sub-indices. The equality of minorities, if we're talking about representation, especially if we're talking about the Arab minority, especially when they can actually have any impact on decision-making or political participation. Israel once again finds itself in an excellent position with a slight decrease over the years, which mostly emanates from various gaps in Israeli society and a lack, perhaps, or a reticence to participate in these political decisions on the part of some of the sectors. Now, in this Olympic game that you can see on the screen, we are okay, but of course this does impact so many other indices, which is the capability of the government to actually govern and to have control. The more you can see that there are more parties, the more parties there are, then it's very difficult to actually make decisions, and our position is not exactly encouraging. As you can see here, we are in these 4 comparative countries, we are competing in the last spot, and unfortunately we seem to win that last spot at times. So now if we're trying to decipher what has really happened, the general conclusions could possibly be there are actually familiar problems that we're aware of, issues of equality with a high political participation, and that, of course, impacts things. So in other words, bottom line is that if we do improve that, there will be improvement in the essential representation for all the citizens of the State of Israel and involvement in issues of what is going on, and to have less impartiality, to have more impartiality in the courts, etc., etc. So I would like to now invite Professor Amnon Rubinstein, the renowned, esteemed professor, to speak about those topics that we just mentioned here. And there's no need to even introduce him here. We all know that he's spearheaded the discourse on governance and constitution in Israel on an academic and a political level, and we're delighted that he's going to address us here.